Hello, my name is King Link, and let's talk about Okami. Now, I'll be playing the opening of Okami on the screen. This should all be in the first hour, and as such, there's not many spoilers here. I did skip the opening cinematic, though. I just want to illustrate what I'm going to be talking about. Okami's called one of the great games of the PlayStation 2 era. I remember going through it back in the day, and everything was Zelda-esque about it. So, an improved version of the game was released on Steam, as well as, I believe, PS4 and Xbox One. Anytime a console game gets released on PC, especially on Steam, I'm going to applaud it because I like how easy it is to preserve the games, and I don't have to worry where I can find a copy in the future if my PlayStation 2 breaks down or any of my consoles break down. So, let me be clear about this. This is not a review. I want to discuss Okami and really one specific part of it, but I do still have to kind of review the game to get there. Okami has some problems. Now, I'm sure some people are already upset I said that, but that's also kind of the point. Let me explain. Let's talk quickly about the big pieces of Okami. The graphics in Okami are so beautiful that I really can't think of anything negative anyone can say about them, other than it makes every other game look bad. In addition, the gameplay is fantastic. It's using a similar style to Zelda, coupled with a really fresh and new system with drawing using the Celestial Brush. The gameplay here is extremely polished, and technically this is Clover Studios, who, if you don't know, they're actually the guys who were Platinum Games before they were called Platinum Games, and honestly, they're almost always great. The story of Okami is fantastic as well. The game is based on Japanese mythology. Now, I'm going to butcher these names, so apologies to those who know the correct ones, but Amaterasu and Izune are fighting against the Great Orochi, the eight-headed dragon, and the game also gathers in the Susanoo myth. And honestly, the game is really interesting. Japanese lore is great, it's something that's not done too much, and Okami does a really great job delivering on it. So, we have a game with great graphics, excellent gameplay, and an interesting story. Why is this even a discussion? Why don't I just rate the game and move on? Well, okay, the problem is that there's a big issue outside of those three things. I played approximately 10 hours of Okami, and it's really rough. I need to talk about three things that kind of hinder the entire experience of Okami, and they're only in the areas of how Okami handles the story. Now, the first big problem I have with Okami is that the game constantly wants to talk to the player. Every 100 yards or so, Okami stops the gameplay and has a character, usually Izune, have to impart some information to the player or Amaterasu. The one part is bad, but it does happen literally like every 100 yards. I wish I was joking about that, and every time the game starts to pick up a little momentum in the first, 5 minutes, there's someone having to say something, and it kills every bit of momentum every time, every 5 minutes. And realize also that Amaterasu is a silent protagonist, as is the player, and that means that a lot of these conversations are one-sided, just tons of information that way. Now, the second issue is that the game doesn't have any voice acting. Yes, this is a PlayStation 2 game, and I'm not going to complain about the technology at the time. However, with the vast amount of story to impart to the player, it gets overwhelming in text form. Instead of voice acting, we have dialogue being delivered 2 lines at a time, as you'll see on the screen. It doesn't help that the game doesn't have a proper auto advance function. You can either click the A button repeatedly to advance one screen at a time, or hold the Y button to fast forward, which will display the text slowly and then immediately advance at the end of each block. Now that sounds like it's good, but at the same time sometimes that functionality will auto advance and have the entire next section suddenly skip. Why does the button operate different at different times? Truthfully, I don't know. Now, I can guess that they're trying to make text that will repeat more oftenly skip quickly, and texts that are important slow down. But from a user standpoint, it's just acting inconsistently because I've never seen either of these texts before. The game will also sometimes start skipping quickly on a whim. You can also skip the entire dialogue section by hitting start button twice, but at that point you're missing the entire dialogue. And the story is very important to Okami, both from the entire narrative standpoint and the terms that are placed in the text to drive the player to the next goal. Finally, this brings us to the third point. The game can never show you anything interesting without immediately talking about it at the same time. You can visit a beautiful location, but before you start enjoying the wonderment of the new area, a Zune pops up and decides to tell you all about it. Sometimes flashing views of different locations in it, not ones that you can actually identify where they are. Now, there's no real exploration here. The player's just being told what's going on at almost every point of this story. Now, this one is particularly bad because almost every puzzle is equally spoiled. Azun will tell you something is used for the current puzzle 10 seconds after you see the object for the first time. The player never has a chance to discover anything because the game quickly rushes to tell you what these pieces are used for, so any personal discovery about the object is unnecessary and almost unwanted. What's worse is this violates show don't tell. The game's constantly telling you what you should be feeling, you're going through, and everything else, including how to solve everything, rather than letting the moment and the emotion of the experience fill the player. Part of these complaints might be because Okami was built on the PlayStation 2 generation. There are definite limitations to the technology of the time, but I don't know if that's a valid excuse. The PlayStation 2 had almost every type of game on it, including Final Fantasy X and Shadows of the Colossus. To say the game couldn't expect the player to feel the emotion from it, or couldn't have a great story or a way of delivering it that didn't feel rough, is incorrect. I mean, the locations in Okami do give the player a good feeling, so why interrupt that with dialogue that just blathers on? Now, this is most of how the first 2 hours of the game are played out. The game is consistently getting in the way of itself and never gives the player the time to really experience the amazing gameplay or world because it constantly feels like it has to be talking to the player. Okami has to tell the player how awesome the journey is and that the stone person that you clearly have an indicator telling you to talk to them has to be talked to, and then have to find out that the stone person, who's clearly a stone person, is a stone person, and then you have to go and find out the next person is a stone person that's also a stone person, and so on. And how everyone in the village is a stone person. Yeah, exactly. This point's getting repetitive, but that's the issue. Okami is repetitive. Now, this is the first 2 hours of a 30 to 60 hour game. And again, let me say, I do know that Okami is an excellent game. I remember on the PlayStation 2 that it was extremely good, and probably one of my favorite games on it. But these first 2 hours are not up to the par in the least. What's worse is, the next 8 hours that I played was only slightly better. There was less talking and more gameplay, but there was still a decent amount of talking. Not enough to make it a good experience. Okami still decides to stop me in almost every single room at every single point to tell me what I already knew. What's worse is there are a number of points in these 10 hours where the game doesn't give any indication of where the player should go next. What's crazy is the game does exploration the right way in the first big open area, giving indicators on everything the player should visit, and then in the second area, there's no indicators, so the player has to explore back and forth a couple times if they don't know where to go. In fact, it might take a few times, especially when the solution is to talk to the same person multiple times, but they tell the player different things. This will eventually unlock the next part of the game, but sometimes you have to talk to them for maybe 3 times just to get the right response, or if you miss that little green triangle that blends in with the larger picture over their head, it's not always clear that they had more to say. In addition, you sometimes have to just explore and find the next location that the game wants you to, and if you didn't realize that you missed something, you're going to be visiting the same locations multiple times because you didn't realize there's an extra pathway. Now, this is very frustrating, but what's crazy is that this is where more dialogue would have been useful. Not only should the characters really have only one thing to say, or at least make it clear that they have more to say in some very clever fashion that's noticeable, but the game could give the players nudges. Unfortunately, the game decides finally not to be verbose and leave the player to wander. Now, this sucks, and I get the idea of an adventure game that is open to the player to roam. But if the player is lost, you want to help them out as a game designer. Now, this is the exact opposite of the problem I have with the game normally, because here it's not telling the player enough. And there's actually a very easy solution to both of these issues. In fact, it's a game that was already out for about 6 years when Okami was released. What's odd is, it's a game in the Zelda franchise, one that the developers should have probably already played multiple times, since Okami is so similar. Namely, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And the focus is on that Navi character who often helps Link with a, "Hey, listen." But players would actually have to hit a button to talk to Navi. So if a player wanted to look at a puzzle themselves or try to figure it out, they would be given an opportunity. But if a player needed that help or wasn't really getting something, they could always turn to Navi, who would give you better instructions. Of course, the Zelda franchise isn't perfect in this regard. Navi can be annoying. Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword definitely did something wrong when the spirit of the sword in Skyward Sword, named Fi, just would not shut up and went on long-winded rants with pointless statistics. I believe we could also talk about Midna, and the point is, Zelda, well, they also get it wrong, as does Okami. And Zelda might get called out a little more by fans in hindsight, but both games seem to get a pass on issues like this. So, we've arrived. Let's talk about the reason why we're having this discussion. I gave up on Okami. I have literally stopped playing it because I was just getting so frustrated with all these problems. But that's not the big issue to me. The big issue is that I went online to see if anyone else had similar opinions about the game. The fact is, yes, people do find the opening long, boring, and dull. It's overextended and just frustrating. Now, the problem, though, is that the responses to this were not to commiserate together or to try to alleviate the problem. Rather, the one response I kept hearing over and over again is, the game gets better. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some really special games out there where that advice works. Icy is terrible for the first 15 to 20 minutes. Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain has one of the most deceptive openings to a video game that I think I played in a long time. I even called it out in my review. The opening to the original Driver game was particularly horrible and just too frustratingly hard. And the beginning of Undertale gives a false understanding of what the game is, though technically that is kind of what Undertale does. But in the case of all four of these games, the problem is kept to under an hour, maybe two. But in Okami's case, people think that this game gets better after 10 hours. That is 10 hours. And the exact time isn't clear, but I can tell you that I really burnt out the goodwill I had at around 8 hours and just kept pushing on because that's what people said, to about 10 hours before I gave up trying to replay the game. The problem is, 8 to 10 hours is a long time to play a substandard part of this game. Most games take less time to tell their entire story. Some people might say the game gets better earlier than this point, but my issue is that the game starts very poorly, and the sections last entirely too long. The "it gets better" defense doesn't really work in Okami's favor. The problem I have is that so many people still call this game a masterpiece, even after admitting this fact. Of course, there's always going to be a ton of people who will discard anything anyone says negatively for any game, but we should be honest about this stuff. The opening of Okami is consistently considered bad or problematic by many sources. I don't think anyone would call it great or a strong opening. I am talking about both fans and reviewers here, though, when I'm talking about this issue. The real problem I have is that it doesn't matter if 50 hours of the game is the most epic and legendary adventure, even if you have to crawl through 10 hours of poor gameplay to get there. Those 10 hours are definitely going to be in the player's way, and telling them, just trust me, it gets better, really isn't good enough. Admittedly, Okami is very good. There's a reason why I remember it as a positive experience, and perhaps part of the reason is it came out at a time when extremely long dialogues were acceptable. Maybe I was just a different person, or without voice acting in every game, we accepted this. But it's Okami HD that's released in 2017, not 2006, and the fact is that the opening is pretty rough, especially by the modern standard. While making this video, I read a number of reviews from respectable critics, and every single one of them talks about the pacing or something along those lines of the very long cutscenes. Yet, every one of those reviews gives Okami a 9 or above, or similar high honors. I don't get it. Okami isn't a bad game, and I want to make that clear, but it also has a lot of issues with it that people seem to ignore because of the great graphics or where the game goes after this point. Well, again, the graphics, the gameplay, especially the celestial brush, and the story are well done. And I do have to keep saying this to avoid someone saying that I hate this game. But the experience of the opening, the onboarding process of that first 10 hours, are some of the worst I've ever seen for a great game. I almost want to finish this game so I could give it a proper review and give it a score it deserves, because I believe I'd have to put it somewhere around a 3.5 or 4, because I'm assuming that this does get that much better. But I'm not going to subject myself to a poor experience just to prove a point. Now maybe that's me changing as a reviewer, where I'm not going to waste my time on something I'm not enjoying, but it is what it is. As fans and reviewers, we need to look at games both for the amazing visuals and experiences, but also to call out when games waste our time with subpar experiences and don't live up to the legacy. Okami is not a masterpiece to the point where we should ignore bad gameplay or bad experiences. In fact, I don't think such a game exists. If a game was an unplayable mess for 5 hours and then entered a VR world which is almost like real life in every way, I'm saying, as both fans and critics, we cannot ignore those opening hours. Okami is not unplayable, but it definitely is a mess, and only by ignoring it do we actually harm Okami's legacy. Now, if you want to call Okami the best game ever, I literally can't stop you. But let me show you the problem. I can tell you, coming into this game expecting the best game ever, I wouldn't have gone past the first 2 hours, let alone 10, to reach this nirvana, because I wouldn't believe that you were correct in those claims. As Okami stands, the first 10 hours would get a 2.5 out of 5 for me. And that's a harsh score, but I think actually that's very generous, because the fact is those opening hours are terrible in every way that they shouldn't have been. The graphics save it from being a bad game, and the knowledge that there's a better game here helps, but in no way is Okami's opening good. Now, all I'm saying here is, let's be honest about these games, and hopefully reviewers will one day figure out how to properly judge a game that has both good and bad portions. Throwing an extremely high score on this game because part of it is excellent isn't good enough. We should be considering the entire game, or at least the entire experience that someone has with the game, rather than just the parts you want to talk about. It's very clear reviewers saw these problems, as almost every single one mentioned it directly, but somehow it doesn't factor into their overall score, or I can't understand that. Now that's really what I have to say about Okami. I'll try not to make every single one of these discussions about how reviewers misunderstood something. This is just a case where I felt so baffled by what I saw online that I had to call it out, because I feel like as fans, it's common for us to either ignore these issues with something that we like a lot, or only focus on the negative parts of the games that we really hate, and both of these are equally destructive. Now, I hope I haven't been a total downer on this one, and remember, I do know Okami is a very good game. What I am calling out is the imperfections and the fact that so many people seem to want to ignore them. The reason why Okami gets its own special video is because it seems to be across the board that most people don't want to hear about it or talk about it, and thus I feel like I'm obligated to call that BS out. I know I could have made a video about the Google Stadia, I could have made a video about Epic Game Store, their exclusives, or spying, but I think everyone's talking about that already for me, so for me, I'm going to be talking about what's actually going on in my gaming life, and that was Okami this week. I'll be honest too, I wrote this after I played Okami a couple weeks ago, and I gave up on the game. Now maybe I'm too harsh, but really, I don't want to go back to it and play it. I'm sorry, Okami, but maybe we accept this more in the PS2 era, but personally, as great as your gameplay is, I want to play you, not sit around and watch you. If you've enjoyed this discussion though, consider subscribing. If you hate this, let me know down in the comments, and feel free to tell me how perfect Okami is down below, or how I got it wrong. Because I think it's clear that I hate the game completely, since I'm calling this out, and thus must be corrected. Until next time, I'm King Link, and thank you for watching.